Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more What If video. Comment 3 hearts for more What If.
Chapter 22. The Olympian God of Destruction. Chapter 22. The Titanomachy 15. Honestly, dear brother, I'll have to agree with our sister. You really are something else, Hera couldn't help but remark, shortly after she and Beerus materialized in his master bedroom. The still naked goddess now sat atop her brother's soft, silky bed. Her back propped up against the wall adjacent to the top of the mattress where his pillows lay, as her brother's unconscious body continued to lay over hers. Unwatched by anyone in the privacy of the bedroom, Hera began somewhat uncharacteristically stroking Beerus's head gently, running her dainty hand and fingers through his long locks of purple hair. A tired, yet relieved sigh leaving her lips as she gave a light smile down at her brother, whose face still rested nicely within her supple, mushrooming cleavage as one arm of hers remained circled around his neck in a tender embrace. What you just did out there was so damn reckless, and yet, she couldn't help but chuckle. Just like that day when you got us out of our father's rancid gut, you came through for us today, once again with that power of yours. Though this time, it seems, you reached a little too far ahead of yourself for our sakes. Feeling nothing but his hot breath still against her bare bosom, and knowing that a response would not be coming, she continued on. Not a trace of her typically more aggressive, haughty demeanor showing as her eyes stared down at him. It appears as though I and the others still aren't as strong as we would like, seeing as today proved things haven't changed much since those horrid days we were imprisoned in our father's stomach. For just like then, it seems, we had to rely almost entirely on you to get us out of a precarious situation. Halting in her stroking of his head for a moment, Hera let out another sigh, only this one carried disappointment with it. Though none of it was aimed at him. Much as I hate to admit it, for all of my pomp and confidence that I demonstrated to you back on the Isle, I've proven thus far to be quite useless when it comes to accomplishing anything of note. Today, I had a chance to do something, and in the face of one of our enemies, with our dear sister Hestia in his clutches, the only thing I managed to do was charge in like an idiot and get caught. The goddess closed her eyes briefly, as she exhaled a breath of further disappointment while hugging the male god's head a little closer to her chest, further squishing her bulging boob flesh around his features. About the only thing I was able to do was fail to even spit in his face and spew words of defiance at him that were about as effectless and useless as I was during our tenure in Father's gut. Were it not for Hestia using her power on him, after he'd stripped me bare like this, I would have been totally at his mercy. She shuddered at the thought, recalling well what he said he could have done to her and her sisters there and then if he'd wanted to, and she and him both knew there wasn't a damn thing she could have done to stop him, despite her words of defiance. Much as I may despise him now, it is hard for me to deny what that bastard said of me, and what you too have told me in a sense back during our training on Crete. That though I talk like I'm strong, in truth, even after all the effort I've put in, I am still powerless in the face of true adversity, like what we got a taste of today. In essence, regardless of how it bruised her ego, she really was, as Hyperion had called her, nothing more than an overly mouthy wench, and that was it. It was only her arrogance that had allowed her to believe higher of herself, until the Titan had utterly shot down any notion of that. He'd as good as made the promise of forcefully taking her and her sisters sexually, and then allowing his allies as many turns on 'em as they'd like to if he'd won. Which if Beerus hadn't come through at the end by cheating to obtain his ascended state, there would have been a strong possibility of, if not a guarantee even, of happening. I'm sure you'll end up poking fun at me for my pathetic showing later. You may have said you wouldn't say anything, but you and I both know you won't keep to that in the future after how much I mouthed off to you prior. And honestly, I don't think I'll blame you if you do, after I've basically proven you right in a sense. She shook her head somewhat despondently and humbly, leaving her vulnerabilities as bare as her body at this point. A part of me sort of wishes you were still conscious, so I could say this all directly to your face and fully admit to my own shortcomings. A self-deprecating laugh rose up and passed her luscious lips. Oh, who am I kidding? If you were awake right now, I'd not speak a word of this to you. My silly pride would no sooner see me leap off Olympus and crash to the ground below a bloody smear before allowing me to. I'd end up much too embarrassed to admit any of this to you, regardless of how you may react, and would just default back to how I usually act to try and save face. Kind of pathetic when I phrase it like that, isn't it, Beerus? No response came, but then she knew it wouldn't. Under all this privacy, she was free to let her guard down and just speak the truth that she would have otherwise hidden or obscured. Leaving my wounded ego aside though, being as gentle as possible, Hera moved the hand that had been stroking her brother's head to below his chin, where she used it to help turn his peacefully resting face up off her creamy globes, which gave a light jiggle when puffing back upwards from the removal. With it balanced just fine, and the rest of his body firmly leaning against hers, she leaned her own head down, tilting it slightly as she pressed her lips against his once again. Unlike their last kiss, however, which had been packed with aggression and a passion mostly for vengefulness, this one was tender. Almost chaste, even, but packed with a ton of affection that Hera had yet shown in such capacity. Lasting only a few seconds before Hera pulled away with a light blush and a heartfelt smile. Once again, Beerus, you have my sincerest gratitude, she said earnestly, as she gazed down warmly at him. Though I know you defeated him for much more than just my sake, I am no less grateful to you for keeping to your word and kicking Hyperion's ass like that for me. For as much as she'd taken her playful digs at him in the past, there was no denying that he'd always kept his word. Her more aggressive side could take shots at how he went about it until her face went red, verbally sparring with him, but what mattered was that he always got shit done. And that was honestly a trait she herself could do with taking more after him on, even if she'd probably never admit that either to his face. Hee, it looks like I'll have to find a way to pay you back for this when you're up and about again. And I don't quite think a simple kiss or an awkward hug and, thank you, will suffice. It didn't feel like it last time when we escaped Father's fortress, if I'm being honest here, and it certainly doesn't now either. Shaking her head in bemusement, the nude goddess stiffened a bit when she felt something hard unexpectedly prod against her inner thigh a mere few inches away from her maidenhood. It took her mind all of about 2 seconds to realize what that was, and when she did, with no one around to see her, she blushed much harder. Especially when she managed to tilt her head to the side enough to look down, and saw, now that Beerus himself wasn't conscious to hide it, a frankly massive bulge tenting the lower part of his tunic. One reaching from his pelvis and touching close to her crotch over a foot away, almost pushing its way out entirely were it not for the cloth being magically enhanced to not tear so easily. My word. I didn't think you'd be that big, the murmur tumbled out all on its own, as a not so wholesome thought of how she could pay him back entered her mind. One that lingered in her head for a good moment before a giggle eventually rose up from Hera's lips as she shook her head in amusement. Hey, given how you've reacted thus far, I'm not sure you'd be too on board with that, even if your lower head seems all in for it. And to be honest, I'm not really sure I'd want to go down that route either. Letting out a calming exhale, Hera calmed her blush as she let the amorous thought of them both naked and involved in a very different kind of battle fall further back into her mind for now. No. As tempting as that opportunity may be if you were up for it, the idea of doing that as merely a one-and-done deal to pay you back just doesn't feel right to me. Looking past him then with a near indecipherable gleam in her hazel pools, she muttered more to herself in a low whisper. Not unless you were willing to marry me, that is. After taking another small moment to ponder the ramifications and the likelihood of such actually occurring, Hera lightly shook her head once more before turning her gaze back down to him. Lowering his head back and gently resting his face back down on her plump, pillowy boobs. Letting the pale, plush pair squish out around his pressing, lightly breathing features which both tickled and garnered a soft wobble from them. Hey, something to be answered another time, I suppose. That is, if I can get past my pride to discuss any of this with you directly. Hugging his face deeper still into her billowing boob flesh, she massaged his scalp using her other hand with a level of fondness that would have certainly taken quite a few of the other gods off guard given her normal act. And provided our brothers, sisters and allies are successful in repelling whatever's coming without you, as well. I have faith that they will be too though, as I'm sure you do too. Leaning down, she gave a light kiss over his dome. In any case, I think I've rambled on enough. She whispered with some humor, as she lightly slinked her own body, and by proxy, Beerus's to an extent, down on the bed until the back of her head softly laid over one of his amazingly soft pillows. All as Beerus did the same, remaining face first on her perky, pliant, pillows, as his body laid near flat on her own. His bulge being ignored even when much more of it pressed down along her thigh as a result of getting into a more comfortable position. The goddess uncaring as to how it would appear to anyone who would end up coming in. Sleep well now, Beerus. She almost cooed in a manner more befitting of Hestia normally than she, as she closed her eyes for a minute. Feeling a weird sense of freedom and ease being able to just let all of her walls down, even if only temporarily, as she embraced the purple-haired god closely. Take as long of a respite as you need. I and the others, I'm sure, will still be here and waiting dutifully for you when you wake up. Early morning, the next day. Metis stood tall and waiting, arms folded beneath her bosom as her eyes looked toward the direction of Othries from the courtyard. Expression stoic and unflinching, as she waited for the inevitable to arrive. She wasn't alone in the wait, of course. Practically everyone who'd been there to witness Hyperion's fall yesterday were present and littered throughout the courtyard in solidarity. Neither she, nor any of the others had spent even a minute resting, in case their enemies had arrived earlier than they'd like. Thankfully, they'd been given enough of a reprieve to prepare and plan ahead as much as was possible, with nobody being left to simply slack off. Everyone today would have a role to play in the coming siege on Olympus. Of that, she'd made sure. Everything's rather quiet, isn't it? The Oceanid found herself being asked by none other than Zeus, who she'd felt slink up to stand by her side just then. It is. She nodded, eyes narrowing. And most certainly not the natural kind. Leaving aside the usual rustle and bustle of training that took place on the mountain, everything was in a still, tense silence. Not just on their sanctuary, but even perking an ear up to the outside, also yielded no sound. Not even the quietest of them, like the calm whistle of the pure wind of the heavens, could be heard at this point, which she'd still vaguely been able to hear less than an hour ago. That was a dead giveaway to her that something big was coming. Otherwise, she couldn't think of any other reason for ether, the primordial god of light and the bright, blue ether of the heavens which they breathed, to have gone totally silent like this. They'll be here soon. Metis uttered in a matter-of-fact tone, as she glared out toward Othries, obscured both by distance and the odd roll of misty clouds that blocked the way. I do hope you're ready for them, Zeus. Her eyes then swiped over in his direction. Both you and your brothers especially, given the risk you three took earlier in leaving Olympus. Don't you worry, Metis. Me and my brothers are more than prepared. The risk was more than worth it, should things become rougher than we anticipate. Zeus replied with stoic confidence, as he rested a hand on her shoulder. And if my plan goes well, then as I'd prefer it, you won't have to do that, was her stern response. I won't argue with you for yours and your brother's decision to visit Lady Gaia on Crete and discover how Beerus pulled off his ascension for yourselves, as if things should somehow go down badly here, we'll need all the firepower we can get. However, it also brings its own consequences with it, as we all saw with your elder brother yesterday. We're well aware. It is just an added precaution, Metis. A last resort, in case my bastard father and his allies are able to get past what we have in store for them. Nothing more. He asserted back with a light smile. You won't have to worry about any of us going against the established plan the instant their forces show up. We know our roles, and will only alter them if it is absolutely necessary. And I believe you. The Oceanid nodded, showing a small smile for a brief instant, before her features flatlined back into a stony mask as her gaze flicked back out to the cloudy horizon. Her sharp eyes catching sight of something glimmering miles off in the distance. A menacing, darkish red beginning to peel through the white and gray of the clouds before them, and bathe the previously serene heavens a more hellish shade. Following it, there was a massive golden pulse sent out in all directions, passing over them and Mount Olympus and traveling well out for hundreds of miles beyond the majestic mountain. And with it, they all felt the familiar sensation of their abilities to teleport and shapeshift being blocked, as an invisible barrier was fully formed all around them. A maneuver that's intent was clear to cut off as much potential for an escape as possible. Get ready, everyone. Prometheus suddenly shouted out in alarm from further back, his eyes glowing gold and making everyone tense. He's coming at us now. No sooner had this been uttered, did everyone fully push the divine auras to the surface as a loud boom echoed throughout the sky. The swift dispersion of the clouds following, with everything becoming bathed in much more intense, blood-red light as a massive arc of dark red energy rapidly flew towards them at mind-bending speeds. In no more than the blink of an eye, the arc of energy crashed into the barrier right in front of the assembled gods with an even louder bang. The force kicking up an enormous shockwave that billowed out all around not just the barrier, but across a good portion of the divine mountain itself, making the ground beneath the rebels' feet shake somewhat. Metis, and just about everyone assembled glared as cracks formed in their shield around the origin of impact. An occurrence that most certainly wouldn't happen with any other attack. It was about then that the barrier glowed a yellowish gold, evidence of the Cyclops' last-minute adjustments, and in real time, slowed down the forming cracks on its surface. The magical shield managing to endure the first strike long enough for the arc of energy to fizzle out before long, leaving quite the hefty spider crack that spread out over 100 meters long and wide. The barrier did not break despite this though, and Metis found herself both humming with approval and gratitude when the barrier steadily started to mend itself with new divine power being flooded into it from deep within the mountain's bowels. Courtesy of the Cyclops themselves going the extra mile and pulling their weight even further, which Metis gave a silent thanks for. So, your little barrier managed to withstand an attack from me, did it? A warped voice distinctively different from a deity in their ascended state resonated from out of the clouds, reaching all of the rebel gods' ears with a hint of bemusement to go along with a cold callousness. Well, I suppose I shouldn't have expected this to be that easy. Those ugly, one-eyed brothers of mine always were quite the clever little crafters, I'll give them that. Everyone tensed up further at the sound of the voice. Not a single soul being unable to recognize who it belonged to despite the distortion. And soon enough, one of the clouds off in the distance dispersed enough to reveal the lone figure of the Titan Lord Kronos stood firmly upon nothing but the air itself, defying the very notion of gravity. His form still glowing a dim red as his infamous scythe was held at a downward angle, with its sharp edge pointing behind him, making it clear to all who saw him that said attack had, indeed, been launched from a swing of it. TCH. What an arrogant prick. Poseidon growled from his position by Hades, who himself wore a deep scowl. I can already tell he thinks he can take us out in no time. And without using his true divine form yet, no less. They'd all been expecting at least the strongest of their enemies to arrive within their ascended states, but it seemed that for some reason, despite intending to annihilate them, Kronos had elected to show himself in his normal state first. And moreover, they couldn't sense any insanely high pressure that came with one being in a true divine form anywhere near them or him either. Some of the rebels couldn't help but wonder if Kronos really was that arrogant as Poseidon had said, or after learning of his brother's defeat, and recognizing his continued absence, had elected to play things more cautiously for a start by not using it right away. Given his reputation, it could honestly swing either way. You've done a good job hiding from me, I must say, but the time for playing such games is now long past. Swinging his scythe back up, the Titan King pulled it back with one hand over his head. For those of you who so foolishly chose to ally yourselves with my children, I shall give you but only one chance here and now to cease your rebellious nonsense. Turn away and join our ranks now, and I will be merciful enough to spare you the horrendous fate that is about to befall the rest. Refuse, and you will guarantee your doom. You can cease with your threats, Kronos. If such a thing as fear of reprisal from you and yours were enough to sway anybody here, they'd have already been long gone by now. Metis spoke back coolly, using her divine power to make her own voice travel far enough to reach the current ruler of the universe clear and succinctly. And after how brutally your brother Hyperion was slew here just yesterday by your eldest son, if there still had been any sort of doubt on us with some of our allies, it's been well put to rest. The Oceanids' words were proven true when no one within the barrier, not even the weakest dared budge an inch from their spot. Most, like Metis did upon mentioning the aforementioned Titan's defeat, showed either a taunting or confident grin, which Kronos was able to see as the barrier's invisibility cloak over them faded purposely for a moment. And besides, I doubt anybody here is fool enough to genuinely believe you'd give such a mercy, given the kind of god you've been over your millennia of rule. Is that right? Kronos' teeth clacked together, as his lips pulled down and formed a cavernously deep scowl, while his eyes glowed red and glared over at them with a cold fury. Angered, but not shocked by the answer given, as his aura spiked high around him. Well then, with his distorted voice rising high, as he bellowed forcefully, have it your way. The scythe then swung down again, sending another arc of blood-red divine energy hurtling toward them faster than light. Which was followed quickly by the authoritative, commanding roar of Kronos resonating throughout the heavens. Atarak. The mist barely covered back over the rebel gods' forms on Olympus Peak, cloaking them in invisibility from the outside once more as Kronos' attack yet again struck home, smashing into the barrier. Another immense shockwave billowing out over the shield with a second, just as large spider crack forming around the point of impact as a whole slew of impassioned war cries flew forth from around the King of Titans. Here they come. Metis yelled back strongly, turning towards the litany of deities behind her with her own authoritative conviction, as she swiped her arm out toward them with a flourish. You all know what to do, so get ready and wait for my signal. Understood. Everyone nodded in total compliance, some prepping to enter their ascended state, while others, like Beerus's siblings, simply focused as much power as they could to the surface in wait, with their auras flashing wildly. No sooner had the impact of Kronos' latest attack on the barrier quelled, and the magical dome began to be healed, did a vast battalion of chariots numbering in the thousands rain out from the clouds at rapid speeds. Riders of all sorts manning them as a divine aura fell over each, most of which a similar color to the one that Hyperions had had. A true all looking poised to break through the shield and take them down at any cost. There are the big ones to look out for. Metis thought, as she spotted Atlas leading the pack, with his father Iapetus and uncles Krios and Koios right behind him, and finally followed closely by his aunt who'd fled from them yesterday after her husband's defeat, Thea. Each and every one, especially her, looking out for blood, as an assortment of weaker gods flanked them. Either as a group of 2 to 3 in and around their own chariots, or were tagging along holding onto the elder Titans. Seeing the full army descend on them like this would have been enough to make almost anyone balk at what they were up against, were they not fully prepared. Fortunately for them, however, she'd had more than enough foresight to predict this very attack. And they were going to show them their response soon enough. Hey! Look who's there, mother. Bea smiled ferally, as her eyes spotted someone that she and her family knew all too well coming up the rear of the first-generation Titans. Styx, as well as her other 3 children, were quick to follow Bea's line of sight. And as soon as they did, they all saw the figure of a male deity manning a chariot to the right of Krios. One clad in a brown tunic almost reaching his knees with dark, wild hair that barely fell to his shoulders, wore reddy crimson eyes, a jawline just as well carved as Kratos' own and an impressively well-muscled physique that looked tailor-made for battle. A long spear being held at his side as the wind battered him and his large, bulky steeds pulling his chariot through the sky. The mother smiled rather viciously herself, seeing her oh-so-missed husband flying straight toward them. Ah, well, isn't he a sight for sore eyes, my children? Kratos cracked his knuckles against either palm in anticipation for a confrontation they'd all been waiting for, as he too, along with the other 2 siblings, smiled similarly to their mother and sister. Guess it's finally time for the family reunion, isn't it, mother? That it is, my son. Styx, eyes flashed venomously, promising nothing but pain as her full lips peeled back to show glistening teeth. Just don't get carried away too early and mess up my sister's plan. So long as he doesn't flee like a coward, there'll be plenty of time for you all to get reacquainted with your dear father. Speaking of Metis' plan, the Oceanid waited until the Titans and their allies were closing in on them. The section of the barrier that had been hit only halfway healed over by the time Atlas and Co. had sped along and were less than a quarter of a mile away. Clearly intent on striking into it themselves before it had a chance to fully mend itself, which in a weakened state, could very well lead to a shattering. Atlas in particular had let go of his reins, his muscles bulging high as his immense aura pulsed outward, focusing particularly on his fist as he clenched it hard, condensing like a bubble around it. The muscle-bound behemoth pouring what was sure to be a monumental amount of his base state's power into one blow as his knees bent, and he got ready to propel himself toward the still cracked section. It was then that the first real phase of Olympus's defense plan began. For as soon as Atlas launched himself with a THOOM from his chariot in an arcing jump toward them with his fist reeled back, Metis pulled 2 digits together and brought them near her mouth. Her divine power bolstering her lungs as well as her mouth with the same enchantment she'd used for her voice previously, and blew the single loudest whistle she'd ever done in her life. One that easily filtered out off of the mountain and past the fast approaching body of Atlas in the heavens, reaching the ground below in no time at all. Being so close and being one of the first to hear it, Atlas was immediately able to tell that the whistle was a signal of some sort, as his body hurtled towards his target. Even if he had been able to react physically in that small instant though, nothing could have prepared him, or the rest of his allied forces for what came next. Atlas, and indeed, the rest of Cronus' forces were left unprepared, as a truly deafening, horrid screech empowered by divine magic resounded out all across the area, covering a massive radius around Olympus. The atrocious sound slamming headlong over every one of them in the blink of an eye, and piercing through their ear canals with a high, scraping pitch like a sharp, grating spear over a wall of bronze, only about 10,000 times worse. Ah! Atlas groaned loudly in pain, attack ceasing, as his hands immediately clamping over his ears as he tumbled through the air in a vain attempt to shut off the horrendous, brain-scrambling sound echoing into his ears. The Titan's body falling just short of the barrier and slamming into the enormous mountain's height just below the magical shield protecting the peak. His bulky frame bouncing right off it and being sent on a one-way trip down to the ground 1,000,000 kilometers below as golden blood began to pool from his ears. His chariot and the minor gods that had been attached to it falling not long after. Grew. Shit, Atlas. Iapetus cursed in agony, watching his son fall from heaven in a tumbling heap in alarm as he too, along with his brothers, sister and allies held their now bleeding ears in pain. The screeching sound generated being beyond the point of unbearable torture to hear, and no amount of muffling their hearing with magic was able to stave off the shrieking cry, as it assaulted their senses in savage fashion. While the elder Titans, as well as a select number of others, were just barely able to withstand the terrible noise without losing control of themselves and their chariots, the same could not be said for the majority. A plethora of deities, numbering easily in the thousands both around and behind them, gaining looks of true, agonizing terror as panic swept through them like a tidal wave the likes of which they'd never come close to feeling before. The horrific shriek either paralyzed them before long so badly with pained fear that they simply failed to keep hold of the chariot they were holding on to and fell, or worse, lost control of their chariot altogether. The latter leading to numerous Titan allies crashing said vehicles into one another as they veered in random directions, causing even further chaos as the chariots and bucking, neighing steeds driving them were bashed out of the air by their own comrades, sending stallion and deity alike dive-bombing to the ground far, far below as both were left totally disoriented. Their abysmal cries and screams of panicked torture as they dropped like flies being almost completely drowned out below the still ongoing shrieking coming from the ground far beneath everyone's gaze. This infernal screech. I recognize it, Krios moaned in suffering, pushing down the panic that now suddenly clawed at his being with all of his will, as he recalled the only god he was aware of that could produce such an abhorrent scream. Pan. Kronos, who'd remained back from the pressing battalion, growled disdainfully, not even bothering to cover his ears even as his blood flowed from them, for he knew it'd be a useless gesture before these torturous waves of nasty noise. The Titan Lord glaring down to the ground below, searching for the god of the wilds as he resisted the panic being summoned up through him thoroughly. Meanwhile, behind the cover of the vastly huge mountain, effectively blocking him from the sight of all who may try to find him for the time being, the goat-legged god Pan stood. His fists being clenched by his sides, face pulled up to the heavens above as he let loose the longest, harshest, magically infused screech of his life. One which was so strong it burned his lungs and made his greenish aura-coated body vibrate as his wide-spread jaw strained itself to the max. His followers, the nymphs and satyrs, who due to their connection with him were thusly the only ones outside of Olympus's barrier unaffected by the weaponized air rape he was generating, kept an eye out for the plummeting gods throughout the area. For once they fell down, it'd be their job, as per Meta's instruction, to help handle all the stragglers taken down by their leaders shrieking in whatever way they deemed fit. Back atop Olympus, as this was happening, Themis propped one hand on her hip and gave an impressed whistle as they all watched the carnage play out, without any of them so much as lifting a finger just yet. Up to now, I'd only ever heard tale of what Pan's screech was capable of, but to see it in action, on full blast like this, is truly something else. No wonder those who'd crossed him in the past were so wary of angering him, when his voice alone can be so fearsome. Fearsome indeed, but it won't last forever. Metis reminded them. A small smirk dancing over her mostly stoic features at just how successful Phase 1 was being. The actual army still left in the air but a tenth of what it had been mere moments ago, by her count. You all know what needs to be done as soon as Pan finishes his first screech. And that can't come soon enough. Demeter spoke with almost a growl, her expression one of impressive agitation as she barely held herself in, waiting for their signal. Those closest to her, other than Hestia, raising a brow at her oddly aggressive attitude, but otherwise just shrugged it off for the moment as her getting herself psyched up for what came next. A few seconds later, Pan's screech, which they could see waving off the barrier as a visual cue, finally came to a stop. And once it did, Metis was near instantaneous in yelling her command out to everyone. Counterattack, now. Everybody, other than Metis herself who remained to hold down the fort, sprang into action. Both minor to major deities alike bursting forth from the ground and either taking flight, or hitching a ride with those who could. The barrier giving way and allowing them all to pass through like it wasn't even there. And within no time at all, the rebel side had gone from the ones being charged, to being the aggressing charge's intent. The Titan forces that had been closest to them, and still remained in the air, cursed as they saw the rebel gods zoom out from their fortress towards them. Exceptionally few being able to react in time as their enemy reversed roles almost and descended upon them. All hell breaking loose as the gods and goddesses allied to Beerus attacked without mercy, dive-bombing into the floating chariots and knocking the remaining riders off with varying blows. Those who held on to others winging their legs and damn near decapitating their vulnerable foes with punting kicks that had weaker deities doing either cartwheels or backflips far off their chariots. Others rushing in and either cloths lining or drop-kicking whoever they came upon off their perch. The sickening crunching and breaking of bones echoing throughout the sky as jaws, skulls and chests were caved in or shattered in equal measure with remarkably brutal efficiency. even for those who'd previously never been involved in an actual battle before. In Themis' case, a sword had materialized in her hands, enveloped in the same divine aura as her curvy, athletic form, as she blitzed through several enemies at a time. Her blade swinging and slashing ruthlessly, golden blood spurting out in various directions across the chariot's gaps as she cleaved off limbs, cut off heads, stabbed through chests and backs, skewering multiple gods at once before kicking them into the great beyond below. Those who were able to somewhat react and attempted to defend themselves or repel the Titaness, were bisected barbarously with darkly graceful movements for their troubles. Meeting the bite of Themis' blade despite the best efforts and were either cut in half at the hips, diagonally down the shoulder to the hip, or most savagely, from head to toe, sending separated halves, bottoms and torsos dropping off in a spray of ichor that barely managed to graze the femme fatale with how fast she moved. Zeus, Poseidon and Hades were nearly grouped together, as they assaulted their opposition. The youngest of them summoning his thunderbolt gifted from the Cyclopes and using it to hurl massive bolts of deific lightning at anyone in his immediate range. The bolts blowing up and electrocuting those unfortunate enough to be singled out by the young god in equal measure. Tormented cries from Zeus's victims littered out for barely a second as the obscene voltage short-circuited their bodies, making them flash and giving an X-ray of their skeleton as their forms spasmed with full-on seizures. They then either fell or were hurled in a charred mess from their exploding chariots, or straight up exploded with their chariot in a blast of gore. Charred remains of organs, bones and body parts flying in various directions toward the ground far below with sprinkles of darkened ichor. His brothers were a bit more hands-on. Poseidon summoning his trident as he flew into one chariot full of deities after another, shearing through them and their chariots like they were made out of wet paper, as he mercilessly thrust his weapon forth. The force of each thrust alone plowing through flesh and bone, as he impaled and skewered his enemies in equal measure with stabbing attacks so fast that they literally blurred before the vision of some, and couldn't even be seen by others. Some were dealt with in a single, blurringly fast strike that go-read them like a fish, while others who attempted to fight back in the disoriented state were barraged with multiple thrusting attacks equally as fast that punctured, perforated and prized them apart in a shower of blood. Their mutilated bodies sent falling down below just like the rest, alongside the shredded remains of their chariots, leaving only the horses unharmed as they made to flee in fright. Hades' helm appeared and made his form and presence vanish as he threw himself into a group of god-driven chariots. None of the poor bastards being able to do a thing against him, as he ran through them one by one. His invisible body becoming tangible only when he attacked as his oppressive aura of fear laid over his foes, adding to the lingering effect of Pan's earlier screech and paralyzing them on their feet as he struck out against them in unarmed combat. His punches and kicks were fast and strong, slamming hard and breaking bones in the faces, torsos, arms and legs of wherever he aimed them. His hands grabbing and snapping arms over his knees like twigs, his fists and elbows crushing the faces of others in spurts of blood and chipped skull fragments and occasionally smashed right through their heads. His hardest blows decapitating them in a gruesome gush of ichor splattering over the soon-to-be wrecked vehicle with chunks of flesh and bone. What remained of those he'd felled already, he either left to fall to the earth as he destroyed their chariot with a powerful punch or kick, or he picked 'em up and threw 'em over with all the strength he could muster. Their limp bodies slamming brutishly with a kerchung into their allies on other chariots so hard they crashed through the vehicle and flung out the other side of the obliterated, crumbling vehicle a crippled, flailing mess with limbs and heads bent out of shape. The stragglers falling down from such were then grabbed by their head or feet as Hades came upon them and were then thrust unceremoniously into each other. their bodies crumpling together and shattering yet more bones, as they were sent rocketing towards the earth and soil to join their battered and broken comrades. Hestia, out of all her siblings, was the least violent in her approach to handling the enemies she came across. Her glowing eyes flashing as she sent out a concentrated pulse of her aura to one chariot after another as she flew by, slamming its dangerously calming effect over the already disoriented lesser gods. Something that, rather than unintentionally help those suffering from Pan's panic-inducing scream, only amplified its effects as her aura untensed them, weakening their defenses drastically. This allowed the lingering effects of Pan's magic to dominate them to a far greater extent than anybody else who'd been afflicted by it, and made even the strongest-willed of those she came up against utterly defenseless and weak beyond belief. The twin of Beerus, with both grace and practiced ease running through them. The mostly gentle goddess weaving through and using no more force than was necessary in her palm strikes and kicks to knock her foes off their vehicles, making them the followers of Pan's soon-to-be responsibility. Whilst Hestia was being more merciful in a way, Demeter was practically the complete opposite. Her body whirring into motion as she soared and ran through her own set of god-driven chariots. Each chariot she descended upon having its inhabitants get assaulted in a whirlwind of agony, as she rained down a hail of punches, kicks, elbows, knees and stomps to just about everywhere on the gods' bodies that she could. Her attacks earning her sprinkles and gouts of ichor, along with the jarring crunching and shattering of bone. Her movements were far more aggressive than they normally were, outstripping that of even Hera at her worst as she maimed and battered anyone in her way on the opposing side with startlingly barbarous initiative. Broken faces, jaws, skulls, ribs, legs, arms, spines, all in no particular order, was what she inflicted upon any poor bastard or bitch within reach. The only one fast enough to attempt to fight her, even in their weakened state, was punished gruesomely for their efforts. The male deity managing to throw a punch which landed against Demeter's cheek, but all he was met with was a snarl, as Demeter ate the blow and battered his arm aside, before reaching over at speeds beyond light and plunging her thumbs deep into the god's eyes. This earned her a pained scream from him as she gouged them out, which was silenced down into a high-pitched, wheezing squeal, as she took a page out of her younger sister's book and swung her leg up with full force upon stepping foot on the vehicle. The front of her foot crushing into his groin in the blink of an eye. The force of the brutish kick alone was enough to pull his feet up off the floor of the chariot, as his balls were bashed down and burst like grapes. For the moment, ball-less god barely having time for his face to show the overwhelming agony over what Demeter had just done, before she grabbed him by his tunic, talked herself downward and slammed him head first into the chariot's floor with enough power to make his body contort well out of shape as it made the vehicle all but explode into pieces below her now hovering form. "That'll teach you to try and fight me, you piece of shit. I'm already in a bad mood as it is." Demeter shouted down to the falling, contorted god with a furious expression in a somewhat out-of-character outburst. Her straw-blonde hair floating up wildly as her aura flared up, before she turned and rocketed herself toward the next and nearest chariot. The allied nymphs that were nearest to her and saw this play out after taking out their own latest enemies cast befuddled glances at the fiery-tempered goddess. A few knowing her a bit better than most, and could tell at this point that something had well and truly managed to get under her skin beforehand, but none were quite sure what that could have been. None of them were in a position to ask her though, and not many were sure that was even a good idea given her mood, so they simply shrugged once again and moved back to following Metis' instructions. Meanwhile, Prometheus and Epimetheus, rather than head for low-hanging fruit, made a beeline straight for their father, Iapetus. The elder Titan, unlike the weaker gods who could scarcely defend themselves against the assault, was able to recover enough of his bearings from Pan's shriek to pull up a guard and block the two fists sent toward him with his forearms. The force of which still sent his body careening back and off his own chariot, until he halted and righted himself in the air. You really dare to stand against your own father like this, boys? Iapetus roared, sounding both offended and genuinely hurt to a degree, seeing his sons fighting for the opposite side. Do you have no shame? Tensing his body up in a defensive stance, the father could only be met by his two sons charging him without the use of teleportation, as they started raining down combinations of punches and kicks against his sturdy frame. His arms and legs thrusting out in near equal measure to block and parry as many blows as he could from his traitorous sons. It's nothing really personal against you, father. Prometheus grunted as he and Epimetheus laid into him with a shower of blows from both sides, giving their parent no quarter with their assault, as he barely managed to avoid the worst of their strikes from landing home. It's more both of us being fed up with Kronos than anything else, and the other side offering a better deal for us than what we were getting. HMPH. So, you were swayed by the mere promise of a higher standing then. How utterly foolish. Iapetus scoffed, only to wheeze in pain a second later, as Prometheus broke through his guard and buried his fist into his sternum. The blow somewhat bending the older Titan down over his forearm with blood spitting from his maw. More like I saw what the future held for this war, and decided I'd rather have some autonomy over my own than just sit back and fight a losing battle for a side I no longer care for. Prometheus sniped back, getting a widening of the eyes from his old man before Epimetheus wound in and clapped him across the face with a punch that rang out for miles with the crunch of bone and a solid shockwave that snapped his body back. The older Titan's form being sent flying off with his nose caved into his face and the spritz of ichor where he'd been. Let's keep on him. He's our responsibility, after all. Epimetheus said with a thin smile and a glance to his older brother. Inwardly not all that happy about fighting his dad like this, and he knew Prometheus wasn't very much either, even if they were on opposing sides, but was willing to do what needed to be done regardless. Yeah. Let's go. Prometheus nodded back in agreement, as the two brothers then shot down for their streaking father with the full intent to either defeat, or at least, keep him totally occupied. In the meantime, Pallas found the dozens of allies around him getting swiftly and resoundingly defeated, with the broken bodies tossed to the wayside down to earth one after the other by four blurred, speeding figures. The divine aura-coated bodies zipping around him as they cut off any possible close aid he could have had, before they slowed down and surrounded him from his front, back and sides. Good morning to you, father. Been a while, hasn't it? Bea greeted with faux kindness, waving almost mockingly at her father who glared back. Now almost completely over Pan's screech from before, as his body tensed up. You four really intend on opposing me with your mother, huh? He asked, more rhetorically than anything as his head and eyes moved to look at each of his spawn for the first time in months. I honestly fail to see what she and you four viewed as so wrong with Kronos' rule that you were willing to switch sides and face me like this. You are aware of the fate that'll befall you all for continuing this revolt effort of yours, should you lose this war, right? Of course, they are. You complete oaf. Styx's voice spoke stingingly from above the second-generation Titan, bringing his attention upward to meet the icy gaze of his wife, as her arms folded beneath her chest. Unlike you, they could listen to reason and could see everything wrong with how things were, just as I did. And the only side that'll be losing this war, is the one you foolishly chose to side with over us. TCH. You really are something else, you know that. Pallas grunted in displeasure as his body tensed for battle. I'm really starting to wonder how I was ever drawn to you. That last bit only earned him an amused smile from the eldest Oceanid. I could say the same to you, Pallas. About the only thing I'd say you were ever good for, in hindsight, was impregnating me with our wonderful children. Turning away from him and her children then, Styx's eyes zoned in ahead of her to the chariot of Krios, and then of Koios, as she sensed the two glaring back her way and theirs. Neither attempting to ascend to their higher form just yet. Which, whatever the reason for that was, she was fine with. A battle in base meant no concern for getting knocked out potentially for an extended period of time, after all. You four be sure to take good care of your father without me for now, she said to her children, as she saw both Titan brothers tensing up and getting ready to attack. I'd love to join you in teaching your awful father a lesson, but it'd appear I'm needed elsewhere for now. With her piece said, and getting a nod or grunt of acknowledgement from her children, Styx burst forth towards the Titan brothers, who did the same toward her. Or perhaps in Chris's case, attempting to get past her to help out Pallas. She would not allow that, and so made a beeline for Krios first. Her body spinning around as she flew forward and propelling a foot out with her blue aura fully up, which slammed into the Titan's forearm as he blocked it. The force behind it still sending him back a good few dozen meters, as she used the force from her own blow to spin her body around at an angle and block Kois's oncoming punch with the knee of the same curvy leg. HMPH. You intend to fight us both by yourself, Styx? Koios scoffed, as the two struggled against the other for dominance. I do believe you might be biting off a bit more than you can chew with that kind of decision. I couldn't care less what you believe, Koios. Styx grunted, noticing from the corner of her eye that Krios had turned his attention away from her, and was now bull rushing towards her children and Pallas. The latter of which had left his chariot and was now bobbing and weaving his way through as many attacks as he could from his four spawn. If taking you both on is what I must do, then I shall do so. With that uttered unflinchingly, Styx surprised Koios by disengaging from the brief battle for dominance and spinning around, effectively giving her enemy her back. The Titan, realizing that she was going to try and fly away to intercept his brother, made to grab for her hair to yank her back, only to get the wind partially driven out of him, as the soles of both her feet planted themselves into his solar plexus for but the smallest of instants. The moving stunning him just long enough for Styx to create a burst of air using him as a springboard and launch herself towards Krios again at blinding speeds. TCH. Damn bitch. He roared out, unable to do much in that moment as she shot toward his brother like a bullet. Krios took notice however and positioned himself properly to defend himself with a forearm block as she propelled into him with a strong punch of her own. A shockwave billowing out as Krios kept himself from being launched backward this time, though he did still grunt at the effort needed to take her attack. Ugh. Damn, you're a nuisance. Pumping more power into his arm, he pushed it out and managed to throw hers back. His aura rising like a flame as he threw a punch of his own which she ducked under before throwing another of her own right back for his gut, which he blocked the same way she'd done, with a knee. And as soon as both pushed back from the other, their auras spiked as a rapid-fire exchange of blows occurred, both battling for supremacy as they swung with a mixture of light and heavy punches and kicks to either slip or break through their opponent's guard. Neither giving way as they blocked, parried and evaded the other's strikes. Styx, Divine senses kicked into overdrive however, and warned her of another enemy's swift approach just as a forearm clash between her and Krios forced them away from each other. The Oceanide's body being a little too slow in this instance to react in time, however, and as a consequence, all she could do was turn a little before the air was knocked out of her lungs and mouth. Spittle mixed with ichor flying out of her yawning maw as a pair of feminine feet all but drilled themselves into her gut. The momentum of the attack was enough to send both her and the assailant shooting back as little more than a blur into the hide of Mount Olympus. A heavy gust of air billowing from the spot where the Oceanide had been, a sizable shockwave passing all over the mountain itself shortly thereafter as Styx's body impacted into it back first. A small dust cloud getting kicked up as her body indented into the absurdly durable mountain, before a snarl echoed out, the cloud getting blasted away with another shockwave, as a dainty fist smashed into Styx's face. Past the pale knuckles breaking and smushing her nose into her face with twin spouts of ichor coming out of her nostrils, Styx grunted in pain as she saw none other than Thea right on top of her. The Titaness looking downright furious, as she thrust forth a front kick that bashed into her sternum, sending rivulets of blood catapulting from Styx's open mouth, as she felt the bone crack and fragment from the blow, as it kicked up another shockwave and pushed her further inside her own indentation. "You fucking bitch!" Thea screamed angrily, the muscles all around her shapely form tensed beneath her flaring, sapphire aura, as she followed that kick up with a wild, dangerous flurry of hellish punches and kicks. Her limbs thrusting and flying forth in fast, punishing blows that sent a plethora more of shockwaves around the majestic mountain, breaking plenty of Styx's bones and mangling her gorgeous features into a bloody, pulped mess as she forced deeper still into the mountain. Parts of broken teeth flinging from her gums occasionally, as she brutalized beneath the powerful Titaness onslaught. "Where is my brother husband?" Another infuriated cry came out, Thea being almost bestial, as she continued to lay into Styx with godly bone-breaking force. "What have you done with him, you damn bitch?" A hand struck out to catch her latest punch successfully, but Thea only snarled again and grabbed her fellow Titaness wrist with her other hand, forcefully yanking her out from the mountain's hide and ramming a knee straight into her gut that drove what was left of the wind out of her temporarily wrecked lungs. The features of Styx's face, mashed up as they were, already beginning to mend themselves before Thea grabbed onto the back of her head, spun her around and then slammed her face first into the mountain with a harsh crunch. "We'll leave Styx to Thea. She can manage her well enough on her own." Krios called out to his brother, getting a nod in turn as both began turning away from the two female deities. The Titan's eyes zoning back in on his son, as he desperately did what he could to defend and evade his own four spawn's attacks. "Let us move forth now and give Pallas our aid." Neither made it far though, barely moving a foot ahead before the two were forced to narrowly dodge out of the way, and then continue dodging around, as a hail of seemingly pressurized, shockwave projectiles imbued with divine power rained down over them. Their holy skin and flesh getting sheared through here and there, sending small spurts and streams of ichor out from several sections of their bodies, as they were still grazed by a number of the razor-sharp attacks. "Neither of you two bastards are going anywhere on our watch." Both turned their heads up, partially to the side, as the downpour of sharp attacks ended. His way back around after dealing with the lesser gods. "Ah. First Styx and now yourself. What makes you think you can hold off the both of us alone?" Koios growled up at him, as both he and his brother glared at the recently born deity. "Alone? Poseidon smirked. You old-timers must be hard of hearing. I do believe I said our watch, if I'm not mistaken. Before either Titan had time to process that fully, both found their jaws getting belaboured into by an invisible force, cracking them and snapping their heads away as their bodies were sent soaring away in somewhat of a tumble in opposite directions. Meanwhile, Thea's grip over Styx's head was broken, as the rebel Titaness swung her heel up behind her and struck the consort of Hyperion in the chin. The blow snapping her head back and stunning her just long enough to allow Styx to turn away from the mountain, mashed features mending rapidly, as she grabbed the older Titaness by the back of her head, and smashed her face first into the mountain, just as she done to her. Digging her face as deep as she could into deific, rocky hide. Her vicious streak came out with a vengeance then as she moved forward at high speed, grinding the Titaness face over and along the divinely durable mountain hard enough to dig a trench with it. The Titaness's blood oozing over the rocky trench, as skin and flesh was ripped from her features over the course of a dozen meters long drag in a savagely violent display. All before she was wrenched free from the mountain at the end, Styx snarling herself as she forcefully tossed the facially shredded Titaness with a booming shockwave far off into the distance. The powerful Oceane then briefly turned her gaze to Poseidon, who whistled at her brutal counter, and then to the space that Krios and Koios had previously occupied, where she knew Hades to be. The second-generation Titaness giving both young gods a nod of trust which both, even though one couldn't be seen, returned, before each fired off in a different direction. Poseidon moving toward Koios, Hades toward Krios, and of course, Styx toward Thea. Watching all this carnage play out from his position away from the action, Kronos scowled darkly over at the barrier after a moment, glaring at where he knew Metis must have been viewing the action herself. Her absence as of now, along with her being the one to have answered him earlier, gave him the strong suspicion she was the one behind everything the other side had done so far. That being the case, she was quite the clever little girl, managing to turn his siege on its head and put him on the back foot in no time at all with their forces. How incredibly irksome, but not unmanageable just yet. There were multiple reasons related to each other that he'd elected to have his stronger forces hold back and not enter into their ascended states before or at the beginning of the battle. And his intuition to hold back during the beginning instead of going all in had been rewarded. He hadn't known of Pan siding with them before, but now he did, and knew to be wary of his presence, as did his army now. He alone, had they rushed in with their full might, would have made things even worse than they were now, had that infernal screech gone off while they were ascended. Because factoring in its disorienting effects alongside a number of their allies being able to ascend as well, things would have been uglier for his side for sure had they thrown all their pieces onto the board at once. And that was just with Pan's intervention. Those blasted Hecatonchias, which he knew must have been allied with the rebel faction, had yet to make an appearance. And as daunting as they were out in the open, Kronos would have honestly felt more at ease if he could see them in front of him right now, rather than not at all. Because all that told him, was that most likely, those massive, hundred-handed brothers of his were being hidden from sight until a later time. And not knowing where or when they could attack had the Titan Lord incredibly on edge, for good reason, and acted as yet another big reason he hadn't charged in full force from the start. Because forget Pan. Those monsters alone, if they got the drop on him, could do a severe amount of damage to his army and brethren. brethren. So even in their true divine forms, because those monsters were powerful enough to match them on their own, and he knew from experience that in terms of raw, physical might, only he and Atlas at the best could fend off a full-scale attack from all three of them. The others wouldn't fare well, and the weaker ones especially would get flat-lined even faster than they were now. Much as he wanted to crush them, he couldn't rush in blindly. Until he had a better understanding of what they'd have to deal with. They had the upper hand for now, what with his damned children and their allies running through his forces mostly, but that could certainly be changed, he felt. Atlas, he knew, was not preoccupied and was clutching onto a lower section of the mountain after taking Pan's scream the hardest. His disorientation shook off by now, and was already looking up with the intent to re-enter the fray. Their weaker allies were being bashed away by the opposition's forces, while his brothers and sister were now locked in battles of their own with the stronger gods of the enemy side. Those who'd fallen already, he got the feeling, wouldn't have it any better once they reached the ground, as if Pan was down there, his followers weren't far behind. And then there's still him to look out for, Kronos thought darkly, the image of Beerus in his mind. He has yet to show himself in this conflict. I do not know why that is, but it is concerning. Is he hiding until the right moment, like the Hecatonchias likely are, just waiting for his moment to strike with some secret weapon? Or is something else at play here? He highly doubted, after all, that after what his eldest son had said to him back then, that he'd have on involvement in a battle like this. Sure, his words could have been little more than a boast, but after doing what he did back all those days ago in their fortress, Kronos didn't buy that for a second. He simply had to be involved in this defense strategy of theirs in some way. It made little sense to him that that bastard son of his wouldn't be. And considering that he was his primary target for this siege, he damn well would love to know what exactly he was up to or prepping for, most likely still within that mountain's barrier. All whilst his brothers and sisters, seemingly bar one other from his head count, were out here fighting. Perhaps it's about time I try and figure that one out myself. Kronos whispered to himself in suspicion, as he brought his scythe back up over his shoulder. His aura flaming around him as his trusted weapon glowed a sickly, darker red than himself. That barrier can take one good hit from me, but if I barrage it, I know I can get it to collapse and make my way down there. He acknowledged the possibility he might be rushing into a trap, but right now, with the biggest thorn in his side unaccounted for as of yet, he was willing to take such a risk. Before he could attack the barrier again, however, his senses kicked into high gear, and he was forced to dodge out of the way as a massive lightning bolt dropped down where he'd been, lighting and electrifying the cloud he'd previously been camped by. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from attacking our barrier, Father, for you have more to worry about now than trying to crack your way into our abode. The King of the Universe shot his annoyed, but calculative gaze up at the masculine voice speaking down to him, who'd been brave and stupid enough to get in his way personally. With his godly thunderbolt clutched in hand, and muscles tensed and ready for a harsh fight, Zeus glared down at his father, with his electric blue eyes having sparks of lightning crackling around them menacingly. I'd advise you to get ready, old-timer. Because I'm about to make you regret not ascending when you had the chance. The Olympian God of Destruction. Chapter 23, The Titanomachy 16. Zeus, I hope you know what you're doing. This was the most prevalent thought running through Meta's mind. The barrier having turned see-through on both ends again as she watched the proceedings from her safe vantage point within the barrier. Her eyes mainly stalking that of her consort's figure like a hawk, as he engaged his father in open combat. watching as both deities lit up their section of the sky with flashes of red and blue, as they soared through the heavens and barreled through the clouds like torpedoes. Zeus's interacting with Kronos in such a fashion was most certainly not a part of her plan. However, she had no doubt that Zeus saw what she saw, which was a reluctance from the Titan Lord to go all out and use his true divine form. For that reason alone, she was able to not have herself be too worried about her lover getting cut down in an instant, and allow him to make such an amendment to her strategy for the time being. Provided he keeps at range as much as possible, he should be fine against Kronos as he is. His only concern with Kronos in his regular state is the scythe, so as long as he makes sure to keep away from its attacks specifically, he should be able to handle him. Thankfully, from her observation, that was exactly what the fledgling god was doing. Keeping any close quarters interactions with his father as low as possible, while mostly engaging in ranged combat. Zeus making good use of his newly crafted weapon by hurling one thunderbolt after another to either keep his opponent at the right distance, or to match and cancel out Kronos' energy attacks. Being wise in his actions, rather than reckless, as they fought. Something that was a good sight to see, given his opponent was someone who, with one good blow with his weapon, could end both the fight and Zeus in the blink of an eye. Trusting Zeus to know how to handle that situation and not screw up like that, Metis allowed her eyes to turn downwards, as she felt the familiar, and very much unwanted presence of another titan clinging to the mountain a good deal below her. She didn't show much of any concern for him though, not even when his heavily muscle-bound form soared up to her through the air on the other side of the barrier not a moment later. His hands and feet gripping onto the magical wall even at a 90-degree incline without issue, despite neither his muscly fingers or toes being able to indent themselves into the smooth surface. Well now, Atlas. It looks like you've managed to get your brutish self back up here, the Oceanid remarked snidely. The second-generation Titaness utterly nonplussed by the older and bigger Titan's angered growl and seething glare from his brown eyes directly into hers, as her arms remained folded beneath her bosom. Quite the arrogant wench, aren't you? He sneered back, clearly fully recovered from Pan's earlier screech, as he ignored the cacophonous sounds of fighting behind him. You certainly weren't this confident back in our fortress, when you didn't have this flimsy little barrier here to give you an illusion of safety. Flimsy. Illusion of safety. Metis arched an almost incredulous brow, as her expression remained stony. Those are some bold words there, Atlas. Especially when you and I both know that without Kronos' scythe, you don't have what it takes to get through it. By all means though, she let out a light chuckle. You're free to try. I'll do more than try. Atlas scowled deeply, eyes glinting with malice. This barrier, contrary to your misplaced confidence, will not last. It will eventually be broken by us, and once I make it through to you. Let me guess, Metis piped back in, cutting the hulking titan off with an unflinching disposition as she propped one hand over her hip and let the other fall by her side, as her tone turned derogatory. Once you get through, you'll make me regret ever siding with those opposed to the Titan regime, and either throw me into Tartarus, have me put to Kronos' scythe, or, knowing you and your ilk, taken as a war prize, after you've thoroughly beaten me. She then rolled her eyes, not looking worried in the least about any of that coming to pass, seemingly. You can spare me the details of whatever punishment you're cooking up in that thick head of yours, Atlas, as I have no desire to hear about your plans to either cut me up, imprison me for eternity, or take me as a glorified sex slave. Her divine aura glimmering over her curvy body, she glared at the Titan general as she stood her ground. So go ahead, give it your best shot. Because I'm not going anywhere, and should you manage to somehow break through, I'm more than willing to fend you off. HMPH. Is that so? He grunted back, eyes narrowing as his dense aura began to dance over his even denser body. Well then, I can't wait to test that confidence of yours, and see just how well it holds up in reality. His voice boomed, as he brought one fist back, and smashed it back down on the barrier, sending out a sizable shockwave that ever so lightly shook the hyper-enforced, holy mountain, but otherwise, had no actual effect on it or the magical barrier. I'm shaking. Metis remarked sarcastically, seeing his punch predictably fail to yield any result. Truly, an awe-inspiring display of your might. A small smirk then crossed her lips again. By the way, it seems there's one small detail about this barrier that you are still unaware of. Oh yeah. And what's that? Bouncing off the ground in an instant, the Oceanid tucked her knees up to her chest, lightly squishing down her clothed breasts, as she focused every ounce of power that could be mustered in her base form, right into the soles of her feet. Her legs shooting forward in a blur of speed before the Titan could react, and phasing right through the wall of magic to crash right into Atlas' unprotected face in a powerful dropkick that took him by surprise, snapping his head back and sending him flying back from her. A decently loud boom echoing out from the impact, as stray droplets of his golden blood fell from where he'd been to the ground far, far below. That unlike you and yours, we and our allies are free to leave and enter the barrier as we wish, and can attack you through it if we so choose. Metis shouted out to the Titan who she'd sent packing a good mile or so away with her cheeky attack. A slightly bigger grin forming from satisfaction on her features with having struck him, as she landed back on the summit's floor with grace. The lower end of her tunic fluttering high in the wind momentarily from the aftermath as she stood firm, exposing a healthy helping of her pale, shapely legs. You bitch. Atlas roared in anger, as he came to a stop in the air, his rage-filled voice carrying throughout the sky, heard by many of those currently fighting, and unknowingly catching him some unwanted attention, as his fists clenched by his sides. His crushed nose almost instantly mending itself back to normal, with his muscles bulging bigger as his aura thickened around him, eyes almost glowing white with fury as he glared into the distance at, to him, a now smug-looking Metis. I'll make sure you pay dearly for that little cheap shot. The sudden whoosh of air close by was the only warning Atlas got as it rung in his ears, his instincts kicking in and to shift his body to the side and barely avoid the upward, cutting arc of a silver blade, as it and its owner flew by his sight. Themis. Atlas thought in outrage, recognizing the Titaness instantly, and couldn't help the feeling of betrayal that wormed its way through him seeing her oppose him and his allies. Before he could say or do anything, in that moment, he felt a strange aura he'd never come across before slam down on him, and felt his will to fight be sapped instantly, even if just for an instant. But that was all Themis needed, seeing an opening as his guard dropped completely, twisting the sword in her grip as she turned fully. Her own ferocious aura blazing over her figure as she moved forward and sliced down with her weapon. The cold, heavenly steel of her weapon biting into his shoulder, shearing through his muscly flesh and getting only a centimeter off from bone, as it cut downward diagonally right to his hip. The only one who will pay dearly here, is you Atlas, for not paying proper care on the battlefield. Themis said coldly as the Titan's ichor splashed over her face as it sprayed out gorily from the deep gash she'd given him. His face a mask of pain, with eyes wide and shocked from her view, as another feminine foot plowed into the side of his head whilst his guard was still non-existent, sending his body sailing at high speed with a billowing shockwave much further out in the same direction it had been going. The Titan hearing and feeling the crunch of his skull, as it fragmented where he'd been struck, whilst the ichor from his still open, yet steadily closing wound, continued to gush out blood in a thin trail where he flew. That's supposed to be our horrid father's general. Demeter scoffed, lowering her foot as she glared out towards their foe, who once again brought himself to a stop over a mile away from them. I think you played him up a bit much yesterday, Themis. He doesn't seem all that tough. What he was though, as far as she was concerned right now, was yet another punching bag to let out her lingering frustrations on. Do not underestimate him, Demeter. I knew him and your father long before you or your siblings were born, and I can say with utmost certainty that he's the most dangerous enemy here, outside of Kronos himself. Themis replied coolly and warningly to her fellow goddess, her eyes never once leaving the somewhat distant form of the Titan general, as his body fully mended the damage they'd done to him. It'd be wise for you to take him seriously, and most of all, cautiously. He hasn't even begun to get going yet with his power, even in his base state. Please, listen to her words, sister. She's known him from before, and has valuable insight into him, so it'd be wise for us to follow her lead in a battle against him. Hestia spoke calmly, tone mixed with a bit of concern, floating down a few meters behind her sibling as her comforting aura fell over her. Its invaluable effect kicking instantly and calming her sister down somewhat before she may have thrown herself headlong into a foe that, by Themis' account, she was underestimating. You'll both have to forgive me if I have my doubts about that. She all but scoffed, but listened to them regardless and didn't immediately charge on ahead. All I've seen of him so far is getting smacked away by Beerus, and now, getting smacked away by Metis and us after almost being felled by Pan's screech. I am aware, but those circumstances are different compared to what's about to happen. Themis was quick to cut, as she felt Atlas rage even from there, and could see his face all but pulled into a snarl as he got ready to charge forward right at them. You are not as strong as your brother was when he did that, and even then, I doubt Atlas was going all out like he's soon to. Even with the three of us, or four, should Metis decide to join us, be prepared for a rough battle. For he is not known as the Titan god of strength and endurance for nothing. Auragush. A war cry resonated out almost deafeningly from said Titan, his godly aura flaring greater than ever around his mountainous form, as he barreled forward. His body becoming a speeding blur of mass, as he rapidly closed the distance between himself and the goddesses, challenging him in less than a picosecond. The trio were quick to scatter as they saw his charge, narrowly avoiding his racing form slamming into them, as the two sisters moved to the sides, and Themis upwards. To Demeter's surprise in specific though, she found her ankle being grabbed onto by his meaty hand just before she got out of range. And before she could even curse at this, the Titan's forward momentum was turned into a rapid spin that pulled her unwillingly along. Both his and her hair flailing in the gusting wind as their forms blurred, becoming what looked like a multicolored tornado with Demeter yelping helplessly at the act. Shortly thereafter, in the blink of an eye, Atlas growled deeply as he let go of her ankle, flinging the goddess at absurdly high speeds towards her unprepared sister, who scarcely had time to let out a surprised grunt of pain herself, as her younger sibling crashed into her. Their bodies folding in on each other from the force of the collision, as they were both sent flying in a crumpled ball of bodily mass a good, long stretch out into the distance. Themis, seeing this happen, was quick to let out a battle cry of her own as she propelled herself down, sword raised above her head for a downward swing intended to bisect the hulking Titan. She was just a smidge too slow to capitalize on the opening that had been presented, however, as Atlas swerved and turned sideways at the last second to avoid her attack just as she swung down for his head. her blade at best catching and cutting some strands of his trailing, long hair, as she dropped down to his level, before his large, meaty hands shot out. One latching in a vice grip that enveloped her hands, keeping her sword locked down in place while the other grabbed the top of her head. Of all the gods I expected to turn traitor, you were certainly not one of them. His deep voice rumbled angrily, as he glared down at her. You should know better than most how foolish such a rebellion is, so why did you decide to throw your lot in with them? NNGH. Are you seriously asking me such a dumb question? Themis grunted in pain, feeling the hand over her head squeeze down forcefully. The pressure being steadily applied not far off from cracking her apart like an egg. Honestly, it seems for all your brawn, you have very little actually going on up in that head of yours, if you didn't see this coming. A low, short, guttural sound left Atlas, as Themis shifted her body enough to strike up with her leg, smacking the front of her foot into his thick jaw hard enough for the flesh to ripple and for him to let go of her. Rather than pull back though, she took the opportunity presented to swing her sword forward and up in another diagonal slice, shredding through divine skin and muscle from hip to chest, and drawing a fresh gush of ichor from the wound. The dainty hands holding her sword were wrapped around again, however, just as she finished the swing. Atlas, much larger hand squeezing down hard enough to garner a hiss of agony from the Titaness, as her bones quickly began to break under the crushing pressure being exerted. The much larger god's almost animalistic growl piercing through her ears, as his smoldering glare fell over her. His wound healing up even faster than it had before, as he yanked her close, bringing their faces only centimeters apart. Look who's talking. With that yell, the mountainous god reared his head back before violently slamming it forth forehead first into her vulnerable face with a loud, harsh thwack that was heard for miles. His harder head shattering her nose and squashing it deep into her face on impact, as her face caved inward. One of her eyeballs near popping out of its socket, whilst the quaking thump of his dense cranium broken and sent fragments of her front teeth flying from open, grimaced more, as her own ichor oozed and spilt forth uncontrollably right as his head reared back. Her blood spurts from her smashed-in nasal passages, as well as her mouth, ending up painting his face with some small, stray ropes that made the huge Titan's face look all the more savage, as he gripped her throat with the huge hand that previously kept hers in place. Her own falling limply by her sides for a small moment, one barely clinging to her sword, as his hand just about circled the whole way round to the back of her neck where he squeezed down again. The brute Titan feeling and hearing the facially fucked up goddess's croaks wafted over his features, as her windpipe strained under the compression being forced on it. It was not too long ago that you and I shared a bed, Themis. He spoke gravelly. A deep, enraged scowl plastered on with bared, grit teeth and a scrunched up face dripping with golden blood that was not his own. Back then, you were at my mercy as I laid with you in the thralls of passion. And now, you are at my mercy once again. Only this time, his free fist reared back and clenched harshly, muscles bulging and popping all along his shoulder down to his forearm, as his aura exploded out to its highest yet. Unfortunately for you, it's on the battlefield as my enemy. With that resounding declaration, he made to strike forward. Aiming to impale his fist through the uppity, punk Titaness who dared challenge him, only to feel that strange aura from before slam down hard on him again. Its effect immediate once more, sapping him of his rage and will to attack for but a second, making his finger instinctively uncurl from his palm, as a haze of dangerous calm floored him. Not so fast, you thick-headed asshole. Demeter screamed out with a brandish of her own boiling anger, worsened by the haphazard toss she'd been given into her sister earlier by the muscle-bound Titan, as she suddenly dropped down from above, delivering a vicious somersaulting kick with her heel atop his head. The back of her foot crunching down on his skull and snapping his head down. His chin clapping into his broad chest with a small, but strong shockwave that stunned the bigger god, and made him lose his grip on the face-smashed, disoriented Themis, whose brutally indented features were beginning to swiftly mend themselves back after the headbutt she'd taken. Hestia's form flew into view, grabbing the goddess gently, but firmly by her shoulders and pulling her back away from Atlas' range to potentially grab or attack either of them. The concerned, kind-hearted deity being sure to hold her steady, placing her back against her bosom to keep her aloft in the air as she recovered. All the while, Demeter immediately launched into a flurry, following up her previous kick by punching him square in the face, smushing his nose deep into it with her knuckles, which rocked his head back a little, before reaching out and grabbing him by the sides of his head and pulling his face down into a barbarous knee strike that she put all her strength into, earning her a small spurt of ichor from his nose as his head snapped up and back, as she no doubt broke it again with how unnaturally misshapen it was. "Don't you dare think I'm done with you." The blonde all but screeched, arcing her leg at blistering speed as her body twirled, pounding into the side of his bulky neck, which made his head bend down over her shin with grounded teeth grating off each other. All before making them clatter as her legs slinked down, her body turned, and her other lithe, perfectly smooth leg shot up in a high side kick that bashed the sole of her foot upright under his chin, rocked his head back a second time. "Our battle has only just begun, you prick, so get ready for a beatdown you're in dire need of." With that said, she reclined back in the air, folding her knees up to her chest, before pumping her legs out straight with an even rough dropkick than before right into his sturdy chest. The attack making Atlas exhale sharply, some droplets of gold blood flying from his mouth, as his huge frame was sent shooting back, colliding into the hide of Mount Olympus and cratering the shape of his body into it with a tremendous, near-ear drum-popping THOOM. A brief lull moment in their battle achieved, Themis was given the necessary time to fully recover from her previous wound. "Thank you." She exhaled gladly, giving a small smile to Hestia, and to Demeter, as she pulled away from the former. "I appreciate your saving me there. Rest assured I'll do what I can to pay you both back for that. There's no need to thank us." Hestia shook her head. "We're allies, after all. If we don't back each other up when the other requires our help, then we'd hardly be deserving of the trust you're willing to put in us by joining our side in this conflict. Isn't that right, sister?" Demeter gave a small sound of approval on that, though it was clear she wasn't fully listening, as she appeared distracted by something. "Something wrong?" Themis asked with some bit of concern, eyes warily looking past her to Atlas in the distance, who had yet to move from his indentation into the mountain, thankfully. The blonde goddess turned to face the two then. Or more specifically, Themis, with a raised eyebrow and somewhat incredulous look. "Did I hear him right? Did you really have sex with that guy, Themis? Are you really asking me that of all things now?" Now it was Themis' turn to start looking incredulous. "Did you, though?" Demeter pressed on, further disbelief entering her tone, as her eyes flicked Atlas' way before going back to the Titaness. "No offense, but I thought someone like you would have had higher standards than a god like him." "Ugh, we are not having this conversation now." The Titaness rubbed her temples, feel a migraine setting in that wasn't caused by Atlas' headbutt. "Yes, we had sex. Long before you were born, trust me. I allowed him to under the promise he would convince Kronos to give me the proper standing I should have with my domains. Something which, as you can probably tell, he never actually did. The bastard. She said, failing to hide the bitterness in her voice from being played like that. Ah. Demeter winced alongside Hestia, as the former turned her attention back to Atlas, just as he pulled himself out of the mountain. Well, that explains it, all right. I don't even want to imagine how humiliating that must have been. Giving yourself to him, all for nothing like that. Well, I wouldn't say that. Themis' cheeks burned slightly with a tint of red. Much as I have a great distaste for him after that, I can't deny that he's a heck of a lover. He's as well built down below as the rest of him is, and if nothing else, he knows how to use that trunk of his damn well. I didn't need to know that. Demeter cringed, getting a humored snort from the older goddess, and a shake of the head from her sister, who'd have also preferred not hearing that. A word to the wise then, young Demeter. Next time, don't ask. Slight blush disappearing, the Titaness moved forward and next to the younger goddess, as she fixed her attention fully to Atlas, as did the other two, when they started to hear distant chuckling from him. Giving his neck a few cranks with his hand, the fully healed Atlas leveled his gaze on Demeter in particular this time, as his chuckles continued to ring out. My. You're quite the feisty one, I'll give you that. He spoke out loud enough for the trio to hear. Got some good spirit to you, something I quite like in a goddess. Although, if that's the best you had to give, his chuckles stopped, and his tone suddenly colder than the Arctic. I'm afraid you're in way over your head, if you think you can beat me. Oh yeah. Demeter narrowed her eyes, as did Themis, but for different reasons. Tough talk from a guy who's been getting his ass kicked most of the time. Stop being so full of yourself. You're clearly not as strong as you think you are in this state, so unless you're about to ascend, you can quit it with your half-assed trash talk, because you're fooling no one. I really wish we hadn't walked in on Hera resting Beerus on her bosom. You've become far more agitated than you usually are after that. Hestia couldn't help but think to herself with a sweat drop, recalling the near explosion the middle sister had almost had when they'd paid a visit to check up on the dear brother. She'd ended up having to play peacemaker throughout that entire visit, and had managed to get Demeter to leave without a fight breaking out. And as a consequence, Demeter was agitated beyond belief, and even now after running through a plethora of their father's forces, she'd still yet to sate the aggravation she held, and that could potentially get her in serious trouble here, if she wasn't careful. Hee, unless I'm bringing out my ascended state, huh? Atlas seemed more amused than anything at that, despite the clear anger still boiling over his face. How insolent. His muscles, all across his body, bulged out greater than ever, thickening densely as his aura did the same, his power reaching a point where steam began to waft off his form, as his eyes took on a dim, pure white glow. For Themis, if she does so first, such lengths would be necessary. But for you. He scoffed, readying himself for another charge. One that had Themis on higher alert than ever, as he pushed out the fullest extent of his base power to the fore. Not a chance. Get ready, you two. The Titaness exclaimed, readying her blade with the tip pointed in his direction, as her divine aura flashed strongly. A sign for her two cohorts to do the same, noting the urgency in her tone. He's about to come at us full throttle now, so do not be impetuous. Meanwhile, with sticks. NNGH. Thea grunted, position held aloft in the air below her adversary. The bones within her forearms shaking, as she had them raised up in full guard with her knees tucking in, tanking the full brunt of a barrage of blows from the eldest Oceanid. From swift and punishing punches to clobbering knees and kicks to her front, the harsh, meaty thwack, thwack, thump, thwack of flesh striking flesh in a cacophonous symphony almost melding in with the other loud sounds of combat going on throughout the vast, endless sky. You should have known when to stand down, Thea. Styx growled. The discordant, yet to her, harmonious sounds of her attacks striking down on her opponent with furious fanaticism echoing in both Titanomachy's ears as the younger, but no less powerful one pushed down on the elder. Ears perking high enough to hear and enjoy the creaking and crackling of one of her hated enemy's bones, as she felt the others barely holding out against her blistering blows belabouring down with the kind of consistency and ferocious zeal that would have put a minigun to shame. You'll only have yourself to blame for whatever happens to you next. Fuck you. She howled back. Deep bruising having formed all along the trail of her guarding arms shielding her chest and face, an unsettlingly blackish blue shade to contrast otherwise pale, quaking skin, as her limbs scarcely had the time to heal in any capacity before more damage was heaped on them by the younger deity's relentless assault. NRGH. Did you really think I'd just sit on my ass back at O3's after the way I failed my brother husband and let your lot take him down? Seeing a slight opening present itself finally between Styx' vicious hail of strikes, Thea pushed past the pain and numbness in her arms, knowing it'd heal over anyway, as she suddenly pushed her form turning sideways to avoid the latest punch, before grabbing onto her assailant's own forearm with a hand, and bashing up with the elbow of the other into her jaw, clattering and breaking some of Styx' teeth against each other while snapping her head back. Her body being held back from going with it, instead being yanked down with a snarl from the older Titaness, as she rammed her knee up into her gut, driving the air and ichor mixed spit out of the younger goddess' mouth. Once I'm done with you, I will get inside your little safe haven and get him back. No matter what it takes. She exclaimed wrathfully, sapphire aura flaring and expanding like the explosion of a supernova, as she grabbed and yanked Styx' head back by her hair, tearing some out in the process as she smashed her fist into her lips, further breaking her teeth behind them before she struck her with another, just as hard, this time shattering cartilage and bone from her nose as it was crunched deep into her face. This, all before a third and final one almost sent an eyeball flying out as it broke her orbital bone, before sending her careening back to crash into the mountain several dozen miles down from where Atlas had struck into just a moment ago. A sizable clump of her long hair being ripped off and held within Thea's enclosed fist from this, before the latter opened her hand and thrust the worthless strands out to the wind behind her, bruises over her forearms well healed by now, as she charged forward. Styx barely had time, as her body pulled out from the body-shaped indentation in the mountain's hide, to pull up a guard with her forearms before her face as Thea shot in. The older goddess crashing into her with a blindingly fast and brutal stomp that smashed her the recovering deity back first right back into the indentation, sending spider cracks forming out around it as she groaned. She was forced to endure something much worse with Thea's follow-up though, as she backflipped off her raised arms, putting some distance between them before shunting forward. The aura around her hand hardening and focusing sharply, as her fingers uncurled, standing up with the tips of her tall nails pointing out straight beneath the vague shape of a spear her aura took around it, as she plowed it directly and mercilessly through fabric and flesh by her exposed belly with a horrible squeltch. UHG. Ichor spewed from both Styx' open, almost mended maw, and right out of her punctured gut over Thea's arm in a garish display, gushing and cascading down to the ground far below, as the latter's hand pierced deep. Part of the former's ribcage being sheared through with the sound of metal scraping along a chalkboard, as the elder Titaness hand plunged through her intestines, ripping them apart inside her, biting into her spine before finally coming to a halt within her. "You like that, bitch?" Thea hissed venomously as she reached up through Styx, failing guard, and grabbed her neck. Further abhorrent squelching and scraping noises following as she vindictively and savagely gyrated her plunged hand, causing more agony to her foe as it dug and tore into more of her innards, chipping away at her bones as well, drenching her tunic a damp gold. All as she squeezed down tight on her neck, slowly crushing her windpipe with her dainty hand, as her fellow Titaness dropped her worthless guard finally and feebly clung to the forearms of Hyperion's sister-wife with her quivering hands. Rather than hear choked sobs or despondent cries of pain and misery to sate her growing bloodlust, Thea was surprised when all she heard was gargled, bubbling laughter rising from Styx, blood-dripping lips. Her facial expression, while certainly masked with smarting, held an edge of odd humor to it that had Thea more on edge than ever. "What's so funny?" the Titaness growled, shaking off the sudden apprehension such strange laughter exhibited from her, as she glared a hole through her adversary's skull. "Kook. Hey, you sound just as arrogant and cocky as your bastard of a husband did." Styx grinned cruelly and spitefully, gold blood painting over mended teeth as she let out a choked, gurgling chuckle at Thea's expense. "Oh, if only you could have seen with your own eyes, GNGH. Just how badly Beerus made him pay for his hubris." "What?" Styx eyes began to glow. The aura around her body slowly rising and waving along like the calm tides of the sea, before a raging storm arrived. "How unfortunate for you, little Thea, kook. Hey, you came all this way to get him back, when he's not even here." Thea's eyes widened. Body trembling with rage, but also anxiousness, as she could tell that Styx wasn't lying. "Not here. What do you mean? Where have you put him then? Answer me." She screeched, spit flying from her mouth and splattering onto the younger deity's face, as she leaned in close, putting but a few scant inches between their faces. "Fur from one scorned wife to another, I'll tell you." Styx grin stretched out into a near face-splitting, baleful smile that held a kind of disturbed satisfaction behind it, with which few others besides herself were capable of. G.O.D took away what was left of him after the battle. Thea's eyes widened further in shock at this knowledge, not noticing immediately that Styx' grip on her forearms was no longer shaky, but exceedingly firm, as she revealed to her the harrowing truth of her husband's fate. Believe me when I tell you, you're not ever going to be seeing him again, not after the pitiful state Beerus left him in. Garush." Thea screamed loudly not a second later, not of anger, but pain, as she was unprepared for Styx' hand over the arm choking her neck, thrusting up in a fiendish fashion, jamming its fingers and sharp nails at full speed right into her eyes. The digits gouging them out in one fell swoop as they hooked deep inside her skull, right down to the now very bloody knuckle, as ichor spilt copiously over her hand from the squishing and grinding out of the goddess eyeballs into paste. Styx being just as merciless in the gyrating of her digits now within her enemy's cranium, as Thea had been with the hand that pierced her gut. The act was enough to get Thea to recoil, pulling her hand away from Styx' neck and latching onto the wrist of the hand, burrowing its fingers through her eye sockets, attempting to wrench the hand away from her face. Styx' hand didn't budge though, remaining pressed against her foe's temple as her fingers dug down and gripped themselves tight inside her skull, refusing to let go as she pushed forward, using the shock of the eye gouge to wrench Thea's hand out of her gut and tenderized insides. The punctured hole in her abdomen oozing out her life fluid as she did over the blood-coated hand that had bits of flesh and a small shard of bone hanging off her fingers. You like that, bitch? Styx shot the goddess' own words right back at her with a visceral feeling of pleasure, ignoring the grievous wound over her midsection, as it quickly mended itself. A few stray strands of blood flying out from the rapidly closing wound, as Styx pushed herself out of her body's indentation, and swung the two of them around, flipping their positions before slamming Thea's back right into the body-shaped crater she'd just been in. The younger goddess earning another sharp, but very gargled cry of fresh agony from Thea, as she took a page out of her book, stabbing her hand straight through her abdomen in the exact same fashion the former had done to her. You know what? I think I'll do you a favor, leaning her face closer to Thea's with a strongly malicious gleam in her glowing orbs, allowing the hate to flow through her like the waters of her river connecting Gears Plain to the underworld. Her whole form brightening under her aura as she was one small step away from ascension. Once we're finished here, I'll be sure to reunite you with your husband. Also, I can see the despair in your eyes at his condition, before the same fate falls on you. Meanwhile, with Hades and Poseidon. Ha! What's the matter, old timer? Having a hard time keeping up in your ancient age? Poseidon laughed goadingly from several meter distance, as several of his latest trident thrusts struck Koyos in his sides and shoulders, leaving deep gashes as a spray of ichor flowing out behind the Titan followed. The much younger of the two's form blurring out of sight after breaking his opponent's latest attempt at a pitiful guard. Gung. Damn fledgling. Koyos groaned through grit teeth, a spear having materialized in hand not too long ago to combat his nimble, and clearly faster foe's own weapon. His grip tightening on the shaft as he managed to see Poseidon charging forward, and propelled it forward, hoping to stab into his cocky enemy, or at the very least, force him to block or pull back. Poseidon instead met his thrust dead on with his own, the middle tip of his mighty trident crashing against that of Kois's spear with a deafening clang, creating a massive shockwave that blasted out around them. The latter's teeth gnashing in frustration as he exerted as much strength as possible to match Poseidon, veins popping along his muscular arm as the vibrations from the clash had goosebumps raising up it. All the while the younger god seemed to be taking it easier, letting out another laugh that further served to piss the Titan off as they both fought for dominance. Not bad, old timer. It looks like you've got some decent fight in you after all. The tanned god quipped, as both deities were forced to disengage, pushing the other back a good number of feet. Though this didn't stop Poseidon from swiftly stabbing forward with his trident even as he flew back, sending out a pressurized, projectile attack that tore through the Titan's exposed hip, sending out another spray of blood from the open wound. All the same though, you appear to be quite rusty in your old age. I'd wager a guess that you have not done battle like this in some time, have you? GNNH. Koyos winced, enduring the sharp, but brief pain as the wound healed up quick, readying his spear for a counter-assault. Arrogant little prick. Your cockiness will be the end of you. He said angrily, before he gasped as another projectile thrust struck and cut through his cheek, this, slicing way back into his ear where it nipped a chunk of it off with brutal accuracy and another spurt of blood. The Titan then, like had been the case for the majority of this battle to his chagrin, was forced totally on the defensive, blocking and dodging through another barrage of trident shots that Poseidon sent out. Bobbing and weaving his muscular frame around desperately to avoid getting perforated worse than Swiss cheese by his adversary's relentless onslaught of ranged blows. HMPH. You're calling me arrogant, old timer. Ha. Talk about projection. If anyone here is arrogant, it's you and your lot, for having the misguided belief that you could come to our abode and take us down with little more than brute force. Poseidon scoffed, as one strike after another landed and ripped through sections of his foe's body, despite his best attempt to block or evade them all, shredding through flesh and scoring a gush of ichor. As this was going on, Krios was arguably faring much worse against Hades, as the former couldn't so much as land an attack on his opponent's person, despite being able to sense where he was. All attempts ending with hitting nothing but air, before being struck by an invisible enemy hard enough to shatter bone. The Titan helpless before the unseeable elder brother of Poseidon, being battered and flung about through the skies in near all directions, suffering through one wound after another that healed up just as quick as a new one was dealt. Damn it, what kind of magic is this? Why is it my eyes cannot see, nor can my attacks connect? Krios exclaimed, both in deep vexation and fear, as he flew back from where he sensed the hostile presence next, able to do nothing other than keep his guard up and be ready for whatever came, as he was given a small reprieve. Who in the world are you, cretin? Or better yet, what even are you? Hades, though he could not be seen by anyone present under the cloak of his helm's invisibility, smirked almost ferally, not unlike a bloodthirsty shark who'd spotted dying prey in the water, taking a degree of pleasure seeing his enemies so on edge and anxious. You ask what I am, foolish Titan. Has it not become clear to you by now? So, you can speak, after all. Hearing the grave voice of the second son of Kronos reply to him finally, Krios grit his teeth, beads of divine sweat trekking down his brow as he glared over at the unseeable presence. Unbeknownst to himself, staring directly into Hades' darkly amused eyes as he barked out. You bloody vermin, show yourself. He. Vermin. Is that what you've decided I am? Hades had to stop himself from laughing near hysterically at his Titan foe. Or rather, his Titan punching bag to be more accurate, given the latter couldn't do a damn thing to him so long as the helm was worn over him. How foolish. You believe me to be but a worm before you, despite how helpless you currently are against me. A fact that wouldn't even change if you ascended here and now. Before Krios could reply to that nugget of information, Hades burst forward and was upon him in no time, drilling his invisible fist directly into his solar plexus. The blow driving the air and ichor mixed spit out of the Titan's yawning maw, as he wheezed painfully, being bent over the younger god's arm as his flesh caved inward, having Hades' fist buried wrist deep and breaking through his ribs like fragile twigs. If it makes you feel better though, Hades began, making himself visible for the first, and only time, with his helm shining ominously with a dark aura over his head. A savage grin dancing across his masculine features, as he pushed Krios back, forcing his caved torso off his now bloodied fist and giving the Titan a brief glance at his face as he was thrust back, allowing him to gaze directly into eyes that had turned a pitch black and radiated a darkness from them, amplified from the helm, that made it feel like one was staring into the great abyss, as Hades cocked a fist back. Here I am. Woo, Hades, fist collided with Krios' face then, striking it so hard it almost completely shattered his skull as his features caved in much like his gut, knocking out chunks of teeth in a bloody spew as the Titan was sent rocketing back unceremoniously from the blow. His body sent rapidly streaking toward his brother Koios like a bullet. Unfortunately for Koios though, he did not notice this fact until it was much too late. Only having time to widen his eyes seeing his brother's body approach just as it was mere meters away as he dealt with Poseidon's trident attacks to the best of his base ability, before Krios crashed straight into his chest with a booming thump. The air being knocked from Koios' divine lungs from this as the two Titans, crumpled up together now, were roughly launched back together from the force. They would get no reprieve even then however, as Poseidon took full advantage of this. The tanned deity ceasing his ranged, projectile attacks swiftly as his form shot forth toward the duo with his trident held straight toward them by his side. He then thrust it forward right as the sandwiched brothers were slowing down, the three sharp blades of his crafted weapon goring right through the chests of both and piercing right out the back of Koyos. His attack skewering them both on his trident like a pair of helpless fishes and spilling ichor from both sides of each titan's torso, further staining their already bloodied and ripped up tunics. Hey, nicely done there, brother. Your assistance, while not needed, is very much appreciated. Poseidon remarked aloud with glee over the joint moans of agony from his impaled victims. After all, it's not every day I get to skewer two uppity titans on this here trident of mine. Hades, still visible as he phased into existence near his brother, was for once amused by his little brother's antics. Though it was more the skewered position itself that their titan foes were now in for the moment, which had him letting out a small chuckle at their expense. I suppose it is not, Poseidon. Though, if I'm being honest, I expected a bit more of a challenge from 'em, given how they're supposed to be our bastard father's most powerful allies. GNNH. Fuck you. Krios spat, both figuratively and literally, ichor pooling out of his maw almost as much as the gaping hole in his chest traveling right out his back from the trident running through him. Nothing but boiling hatred frothing to the surface, as both flesh and bone were shredded in equal measure, with his spine cut in half, and were it not for his brother being pressed on his back, it would have been jutting out precariously from the exit hole with how violently it had been ripped in two. UNNGH. You think that this is all we have? He huffed and wheezed, tasting his own ichor as he glared balefully up at both brothers. His divine aura rising from his impaled body despite the pain present. Well, outside of your true divine forms, which you've been barred from use of, by the looks of things, yes. Poseidon shrugged, intentionally shifting his trident's weight and position so that it gruesomely stirred and grinded the insides of both titans, Krios with the shaft, and Koyos with the tri-pronged blades. Forcing both to grunt and groan through the grounded teeth. As to their surprise, divine water began to coalesce around the weapon currently stabbed through them both. The aqua swirled sharply and with a sense of controlled grace, as it encompassed the weapon from the tips of the blades poking out Kois's back, all the way down to the end of the shaft. Its clear tendrils of heavenly liquid also traveling all the way up and around Poseidon's holding arm, rapidly twisting and turning like a vortex as it submerged the limb within its thin, but dense depths. All as a thick, wavy, sea-green aura fell over both it and Poseidon himself. Poseidon's almost jubilant smile then vanished, along with any air of amusement as a dark scowl to match the presence Hades gave off etched over his now glaring features, which glowed a lighter, sea-green hue. The real question is, do you two old-timers sincerely believe that that was the best we could do? This brat, both titans thought simultaneously, as they heard the sound of the sea's whistle and splashing waves in their ears, as though they were right beside it. And as the summoned water enveloping Poseidon's trident like a maelstrom began to churn through the guts like a meat grinder, the two couldn't help but be reminded of someone they had not seen in a long time, as they looked into his glowing eyes and felt his aura. He feels, just like Oceanus. Because I assure you, Poseidon went on, gripping the shaft of his trident hard as he willed the water surrounding it to become wilder still, vaguely forming the shape of razor-sharp spikes as it swirled around dangerously. The watery spikes carving deeper into their organs, flesh and bone all around it almost like a chainsaw, before, with a widening of his radiantly glowing pools, he exclaimed. It isn't. Then, with a hard torque of his wrist, The divine water-coated trident swung back and forth in a zigzag pattern, cleaving both titans in two. The upper parts of their torsos being ripped away gorily from the lower half and their legs in a shower of blood and guts that poured from their bisected areas, as both ends began a very steep fall. The shocked expressions of agony showing on both titans' faces, even if such a lethal wound would only last for a moment before both were back to full health, as they plummeted down far away from the younger set of brothers. Poseidon then let out a sigh. A small grin returning to his features, as he regarded his brother Hades a bit more casually, now that they had a small window of reprieve. You know, as much as I appreciate this weapon, a part of me really wishes it could do what Beerus's sword did to Hyperion. So that way, we wouldn't have to deal with those two in this war, again. Can't say I argue with that, brother. The older sibling nodded. Even still though, we all have our own unique benefits with our weapons, and I get the feeling that none of us have truly scratched the surface of what they're capable of just yet. Poseidon hummed at that, recalling what Beerus had already shown that each weapon was capable of without their more unique attributes being thrown in or amplified, nor just how insanely powerful they'd become in time with the growing strength and abilities. True. A pause. I'd still prefer the destructive power to end an enemy, though. He got a slap to the head from a tickled Hades in response. Just drop down there and keep up on those two with me, will you? Poseidon simply chuckled, following his brother's lead as he flew down to the, for now, falling enemies. Around that time, with Prometheus and Epimetheus. NNGH. Damn, what are those two playing at? Iapetus barked angrily, as he and his sons disengaged from their own combat briefly, allowing the father of the two to witness his two siblings getting utterly torn asunder and fall away, shamefully, in pieces. How are they allowing themselves to get decimated like that? Even though it was clear that the question was more rhetorical than anything, Prometheus was still quick to respond slyly. Perhaps this is what happens when you become too complacent. Those who are hungrier, and more ambitious, end up passing you out. Well, that, and a little helping hand from the Cyclops never hurt anyone. Epimetheus not so subtly revealed as he glanced over his shoulder at the current goings of the battle above them, before turning back to a downright thunderous Iapetus, who looked far from amused. No one except for you guys, of course. TCH. Damn Cyclops inventions, I should have guessed. The elder Titan grumbled, as his focus went back fully to his sons. I might have to agree with you there. To have allowed all of this to happen, we truly have been quite complacent. Perhaps if your side had treated us a little better, father, and had Kronos actually listened to what I had to say, among other things, then you wouldn't be dealing with this right now. Prometheus sniped back unashamedly, getting a nod from his brother in agreement. Iapetus merely sighed, not even attempting to dispute the claim. In any case, that complacency will have to be rectified once this war is over. Something like this can never be allowed to happen again. Oh, I agree. Prometheus nodded. The only thing is, you and yours aren't going to be the ones in power when all is said and done. He pointed behind him to Mount Olympus, as though it signified the group of young gods he'd pledged himself to, as a collective. They will. The Olympians. Iapetus snorted. Not buying into that for a second. The Olympians. Oh, how original. Naming themselves after their abode. Tell me, did you just pull that name out of your ass now, my boy, or did one of them come up with that genius title? Does it even matter? Prometheus shrugged, taking the jab in stride for what both of them knew was something he had, in fact, just pulled out of his ass. What matters is that they'll win in the end, and usher in a new era by doing so. Of that, I have no doubt. HMPH. I beg to differ. The father of the rebellious Titans scoffed, as he curiously kept his arms lowered to his sides, rather than re-enter a battle stance. Something both his sons were quick to notice. Not going to try attacking us again there, father? Epimetheus asked with a tilt of his head, as he folded his arms over his chest. A cheeky grin playing over his lips. Have you given up already? Hardly, my son. Planting his hands on his hips, Iapetus eyed them both critically. I just don't see a reason in continuing our battle as it is in our base states, what with one of you being able to predict my every attack before it happens and react to it in kind. There's little point in progressing with something that'll just go on in an endless loop of me getting countered and being unable to utilize my own unique ability at any point. His eyes then narrowed sharply. Knowingly. That's the real reason you two were made to target me specifically, isn't it? Guilty as charged. Prometheus shrugged once more, this time with a grin as he mirrored his father and propped his hands on his hips. While we're on that subject though, mind telling us why your lot chose to show up in base form rather than being ascended from the beginning? Come now, you think we'd be that foolish? Iapetus rebuked coldly. Don't play coy with me, boy. We're well aware of a certain trio of 100-handed, 50-headed, ugly giants that were broken out of Tartarus not too long ago as well, and their suspicious absence from the battlefield. As soon as we noticed that none of them were in sight, we knew not to engage with our full strength, even before our brother ordered it so. None of us would be dumb enough to do so without knowing where those bastards are, for we know from first-hand experience what those repulsive brothers of ours are capable of. Well, you and the elder Titans, that's true. The Titan of Forethought acknowledged, having never seen the Hecatonchirs in action himself, but having been told of their might by his father in youth. Something that had him suspecting Kronos had thrust them down into Tartarus for more than just how ugly they were. However, Prometheus' eyes glowed a faint gold, as a vision of the future hit him, making him chuckle at his father's claim. When it comes to truly recognizing such a threat, are you sure everyone remaining is gonna keep in lockstep with that? What? Meanwhile, up above. Damn it all, Pallas thought to himself, cursing his position as he narrowly dodged a punch from Kratos, then a swinging kick for his head by Beerus as he pushed back, before being forced to just barely block a double, one-footed dropkick from Nike and Zealous using his recently materialized spear. The latter of which had him grunting as he was forced back in the air, having abandoned his now wrecked chariot the instant this 4-on-1 bout had started. The god having done little other than evade his children the whole time, as there wasn't much chance for attack. What's the matter, father? Having trouble keeping up with us? He heard his daughter, Bea, ask mockingly as she rounded to his side and charged him for another attack. Pallas, seeing this, managed to push his two other children away and pull back just in the nick of time to avoid the strike and deliver a swift counter with his spear. Or so he thought. Bea smirked, seeing her father's full attention shift to her briefly, as she brought herself to a halt just out of his range with her fist raised up in the air. Her voice smug as she simply said, "Got you." Pallas' eyes widened when he felt the air shift right behind him, and before he could do anything, felt two hands grab onto his head, before he was wrenched back into a barbarous knee that struck his spine. Hack! He gasped in pain, as he felt the skeletal structure of his back bend and contort along with his body in a rather agonizing angle, before he reversed grip on his spear and aimed it behind him before thrusting it down. To his surprise though, he heard a grunt of pain alongside the unmistakable sound of his weapon piercing through flesh and bone, drawing out a few spurts of blood that doused the side of his shoulder and neck. His wide eyes shooting back to see that Kratos, rather than dodge his spear, had elected to eat the counterblow instead. The beefy god letting the cold, sharp metal bite deep through his own muscly shoulder, so that the arm it belonged to could grab onto the shaft despite the flaring pain that rewarded him for it, while circling his other arm around his father's neck, locking him in place. "No more avoiding us, father." Kratos' deep, gravelly voice remarked with a hint of satisfaction, as Pallas struggled to break away from his son's hold, but to little avail, even when he drove his elbow into his gut once, twice, then thrice. His efforts earning him little more than pained, but enduring grunts from the younger god, as he kept his hold of him firm. His bulky arm only tightening around the older titan's neck, as he growled out, "It's time you got dealt your punishment for betraying us." Before Pallas could even say anything in reply, he felt the wind, spit and ichor get knocked out of his maw, as Beer shot in and drove her fist deep into his gut, practically burying herself down to the elbow, as she cackled with glee below the arm still holding his spear. "You like that, Daddy? Because there's going to be a lot more where that came from," she said with a level of joy she only felt when being violent, as she pulled her fist out of his caved gut, dripping with his golden life fluid before thrusting that same fist up in an uppercut that snapped his head back with a deafening crack. A cry of bliss leaving her as she did. "Ugh. Fucking bitch." Pushing through the dizziness and pain, Pallas reached out with his free hand and grabbed Beer by the face, aiming to snap her neck like that and chuck her away. NNGH, grr. Spit and ichor flew from Pallas' mouth yet again as Nike flew in then, delivering a vicious knee to his only halfway mended gut, before smacking him hard across the face with a swift, deadly elbow that snapped it to the side and almost turned his head facing the opposite way round from the force. Several broken teeth being ejected from his bloody mouth in the process, as he lost his grip over Beer, before his two daughters joined together, torquing their hips in unison as they each swung themselves around and smashed their heels directly into his lower sides, simultaneously shattering both his hips with a resounding shockwave that was felt for miles. "You deserve every bit of this and more once Mother gets her hands on you," Nike said coldly, but with her own vicious smile relishing their traitorous father's pain and suffering, as her more muscular sister laughed in agreement beside her. A shadow was then cast above him, causing the Titan to look up just in time to see his other son's foot stomp down on his face hard enough to crunch his skull. The blow eviscerating every bone in his nose as it flattened like a pancake beneath the weight and momentum of the soul crushing down on it, while chipping and breaking his front teeth in a ghastly show of force as his face was caved inward. "Anything else to give, father? Or will that be all from you?" Celis goaded, before hopping up from his estranged parents' features, somersaulting around, and then swinging the heel of his other foot down in a cleaving blow that bashed down on the lower section of his gaping mouth. The heel bellyboring through both regenerating teeth and bone alike with such incredible force that it both broke, and ripped the lower jaw of the Titan clean off. Ichor spilling out uncontrollably from his torn mouth as bits of flesh hung from the space where the now falling chunk of flesh and bone once was. By this point, the pain had become so intense for Pallas, that he'd let go of his spear as gargled, guttural sounds of agony rose through his torn apart, blood-oozing jaw. A mistake he'd regret immediately in his tormented mind, as Beer grabbed and pulled the spear free from Kratos' shoulder, garnering little more than a slight wince from him and a small oozing of ichor, before she aligned and thrusted it forward. The cold, sharp metal stabbing through Pallas' chest and running right through his heart with a nasty, audible squelch. "Hey, this is a nice spear you got here, Daddy." The goddess embodying force laughed with a cruel, teasing air. Feeling no remorse, only pleasure, from finally getting to hurt their father like this. It's a great weapon for impaling your enemies on. And speaking of impalement, she turned to look over at each of her siblings with an all too sweet smile that promised nothing but torture for the Titan. "What do you guys say? After we've gotten a few more licks in, we stick this thing right up where Helios definitely doesn't shine." If Pallas could have at that point, he would have cursed them all for their horrid actions against him. Alas, all he could let out was an angered and hurt gurgling noise, as his other children nodded in agreement with Beerus' words. He couldn't help but think, why was he letting this happen? For how long would he have to endure such torture from his spawn, such humiliation, before Kronos gave him the go-ahead to ascend? And the latter being over the threat of these Hecatonkaias, he showed such concern for, yet weren't even here. Nor had they made any move to attack, despite the numerous opportunities he was sure they could have taken by now. What, was he supposed to just wait until those giants made a move? If they even made a move. For all they knew, the threat of those giants, whom had been locked up in Tartarus well before he was born, could be little more than a farce in this situation. A clever ruse of them hiding away until they decided to strike, when in reality, they may not be involved with the defense of Mount Olympus at all. Effectively making him be forced to endure the harsh persecution of his bastard children for minutes, hours, or even days, given how spiteful they were, for absolutely nothing. For as much as he pledged his allegiance to Lord Kronos, even he could see how paranoid the Titan King of the universe had been of late. A lot of them did, despite his attempts to hide it. It was entirely possible that Kronos was simply overthinking these so-called monstrous giants' lack of appearance, and was allowing his paranoia to get ahead of him. And even if he wasn't, then that still left the lingering question as to when exactly they'd be allowed to cut loose and use their true divine forms. Surely, he didn't expect them to wait forever until those giants potentially made their move, right? Because they sure as shit weren't getting anywhere as they were now. In fact, it didn't seem like anything would move forward, outside of his children's abuse, as he felt them bludgeon his body repeatedly with their attacks, knocking his head around, breaking his bones and rending his flesh repeatedly every time they'd healed up or were close to. Mutilating him with their arms and legs, as well as his own spear to add extra insult to injury. I can't wait much longer, Lord Kronos, he thought, turning his gaze out over to where Kronos was, currently zipping around in his own aerial projectile battle with the silver-haired deity. The progressively more aggravated and frustrated god hoping and waiting out through the constant abuse for Kronos to finally give them the command he desperately wanted right now to get these pests he called children off of him. To teach them and those they'd allied with a lesson they won't soon forget. Please, give me the order, Lord Kronos. I cannot stand for this embarrassment much longer. Answer, giving his lord the benefit of the doubt, he waited. And waited. And waited some more for the order that never came. Time simply ticking by as, all the while, he could hear the disrespectful, ungrateful little shits around him effectively having a laugh and enjoying themselves at the expense of his torment. Like his sole purpose for existing at the minute was for their malicious pleasure. Driving him further and further to the edge, until... All right then, Beerus said with a sickening grin that he'd love nothing more than to tear off her face, as she pulled out and held his spear in hand, dripping with his ichor all over the sharp tip. Her other siblings having halted in their beatdown of him momentarily. I think that's enough preamble, brothers, sister. How's about we give our mother a sight to see while she deals with Thea, and finally shove this spear so far up his ass that it comes out the other end. No better way to humiliate this prick of a father we have, I'd say. No argument from me. Kratos rumbled. I'd say mother would love to see that. Nike nodded. I agree. Celis affirmed. You bloody brats. Pallas seethed, his rage spiking to an all-time high as veins began to pop all around his neck and face. His reground jaw gnashing its teeth down as he felt the eyes of his so-called children on him with the desire to complete his humiliation, no doubt before continuing his torture any just to sate the depraved lust for vengeance on his person. As he noticed Beer readying his spear, his eyes snapped over to his lord one last time, with one last sliver of hope that Kronos would end his suffering by finally giving the order, and allowing him to ascend and properly deal with these uppity little shits he'd once proudly called his sons and daughters. It didn't take him long to realize, as Kronos continued to waste time humoring that other uppity god in projectile warfare, that again, no such order would be forthcoming. He was being left to his own devices here. Something finally snapped within him in that moment. His eyes beginning to glow a magenta red in unbridled fury, as the final tether of his self-control was shredded apart, much like his insides would be if these impudent gnats impaled and made a further mockery of him. I've had enough of this. He thought, his breaking point reached as an almost animalistic growl rose up from within him. A white-hot, primal rage beginning to consume him as his power began to rapidly climb higher. Something his children were all too quick to notice, but wouldn't be fast enough to do anything about. Screw waiting for an order. I don't care if there are some stupid giants waiting in the wings or not, I refuse to allow this embarrassing exchange to go on any longer. His body beginning to shine brightly, along with his power shooting sky high, did not go unnoticed by the other participants in the battle, as a shockwave burst forth from him, sending Kratos flying back behind him, and the rest of his trash spawn away from him. The four forced to shield their faces, while the others further out felt the immensity of his divine power flow out throughout the skies like a wave of magenta fire. And from her perch upon Olympus, watching this all play out, Metis only smirked slyly. The goddess pleased seeing another piece fall exactly into place, as she watched Pallas unknowingly become the trigger for the next stage of her plan. Meanwhile, on the Isle of Crete. As that bright flare of Pallas' aura went off, bathing a large swath of the sky above a light hue of magenta red, the 300-handed ones watched from below. The trio smirking like absolute savages as each stood by several towering piles of massive boulders that reached just as tall as they were, and nearly 3 times the width. Be watchful, Cottus, Gyges. Briareus, the oldest of the 3 Hecatonchirs, said as they watched everything clearly unfold. Their overwhelming size allowing them to see across vast distances as though they were right next to them. Metis' signal shall come soon. And when it does. Reaching behind him, half of his hands laid over various boulders, gripping onto them in anticipation as his monumentally huge muscles tensed and bulged in anticipation. His brothers following suit as he picked up the top one from his pile, and began casually tossing the sizable boulder that easily filled out his uppermost hand up and down on his palm, as a truly titanic, dark grayish-blue aura enveloped both him, and every boulder he touched. Briareus' teeth then bared across all of his 50 faces in face-splitting smiles, as he riled up his brethren with one solemn, but bloodthirsty declaration. We're gonna squash those puny punks into paste.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what if.